Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on the Visitor Levy Amendment Scotland Bill at Stage 1, and it is now time to move on to the next item of business. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20844 in the name of Shona Robinson on the Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2026-27. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak button as I call on Shona Robinson, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and to move the motion up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I can confirm that I move the motion. As I begin this debate, I'd first like to draw Parliament's attention to the procedural connection between this debate and Rule 9.16.7 of the Standing Orders, which states that a Scottish rate resolution must be agreed before Stage 3 of the Budget Bill to be able to proceed. Presiding Officer, this rates resolution gives Parliament an opportunity to provide stability in our tax system while delivering vital investment in our public services and giving our young people more opportunities to learn and flourish. Our approach to date has shown that there is not a trade-off between a progressive tax policy and the economy. Since 2007, Scottish GDP per person has grown by 8.7%, compared to 6.7% in the UK, and is set to continue to grow faster in the latest forecasts, as are earnings. Unemployment also remains lower in Scotland, forecast at around 4.2%, lower than in the UK over the next 5 years. In a second, the recent Ernst & Young's annual attractiveness survey continues to show greater growth in foreign direct investment projects in Scotland than the rest of the UK. And since the introduction of Scottish income tax in 2017-18, more taxpayers have come to Scotland than have left, with net inflows averaging almost 4,200 per year. I'll take Craig Hoy.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I think perhaps the only moment of consensus I would say we do agree on the case for a progressive tax system, but can the Minister say how is it progressive to have a higher percentage of workers in higher tax rates year after year after year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, look, can I say to Craig Hoy that around 3/4, 74% of taxpayers are expected to be unaffected by maintaining the higher rate threshold at the same level. But the question Craig Hoy has to answer is how it can be possible for £1 billion of unfunded tax cuts, which is what he and his party are proposing, to come out of public services at the same time as demanding increases in public spending. That is just not a credible position, and it would come out of frontline services because, as I explained to Craig Hoy at committee, it would take at least a year for the changes to social security policy that he's proposing. God forbid there would ever be a Parliament that would agree with that. So what would have to happen before the 1st of April, under the world of which Craig Hoy wants to create, is frontline services being cut, including the £250 million that is going to local government, including the additional funding for colleges, including the additional funding for the NHS. All of that would have to go, because there would be £1 billion of less revenues coming in from tax. So those are the facts. Might not like it on the Tory benches. They might not like facts being pointed out to them, but they are facts nonetheless. These are the positive economic indicators that I set out earlier on that demonstrate the continued resilience of the Scottish economy. And turning to our income tax policy, at last year's budget, our tax strategy made specific commitments for the remainder of this Parliament. These were to, firstly, keep the same number of income tax bands, not make any increases to rates, ensure the starter and basic rate bands rise by at least inflation, and continue the position whereby a majority of taxpayers can expect to pay less than in the rest of the UK. These are the commitments that we have stuck to for 26-27 and that this rate resolution delivers. We propose increasing the basic and intermediate rate thresholds by 7.4% in 2026-27, an investment of over £50 million in lowering households' tax bills. And when considered alongside the policy last year, this means that the basic and intermediate rate thresholds will have risen by around twice the rate of inflation over the last 2 years. And we are continuing with our balanced approach and propose maintaining the higher advanced and top rate thresholds at their current levels. And this means asking those with broader shoulders to pay a little more to continue delivering the public services that people rightly expect. Many families will feel the benefit of this government's policies cumulatively, rather than just on income tax alone, whether it's free prescriptions, abolishing peak rail fares, free higher education, or the Scottish Child Payment, which I know the Tories do not seem to support any longer. And when combined, these savings often outweigh the small annual tax differences with the rest of the UK. So it will mean, for example, on average, households in the lower half of the income distribution are around £480 better off a year than under the UK tax and social security policies. £480 better off a year. So we've fulfilled our tax strategy objective to provide a period of stability for the remainder of this Parliament and delivered on our commitment to protect lower income households. Presiding Officer, we hear time and time again in this chamber calls from other parties on what additional spending choices they would have us make. However, the reality of the matter is that you cannot will these things into existence. It requires dialogue, difficult choices and the conviction to make it happen, and that is what this government is doing. It requires the resources. You cannot will the means, you have to provide the means, and the rates resolution provides the means. In the run-up to the budget, we were grateful to those colleagues across this chamber who did enter into meaningful engagement with the government. Our balanced, progressive approach to income tax policy goes some way in allowing us to protect the social contract, which provides a range of services not available elsewhere in the UK. The income tax proposal set out today underpins the entire budget settlement that we've been debating in Parliament and provides the investment that ensures our public services can be properly funded. So, in conclusion, let me set out what positive changes only go ahead if Parliament votes for today's rates resolution and budget overall. It means lowering income tax bills for most taxpayers in our society, putting more money in people's pockets to help with the current cost of living pressures. From April 2027, boosting to £40 a week the Scottish Child Payment for families with a baby under 1, providing additional support for those who need it most. A record £17.6 billion for NHS frontline services, supporting the vital work of GPs and primary care services, and more than £5 billion towards measures that will reduce Scotland's carbon emissions. So, Presiding Officer, this government is clear on what its priorities are and what it means to households across Scotland. And that's why I ask members today to vote to ratify the proposed changes to Scottish income tax in 2026-27. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Craig Hoy to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Minister talks of stability, and after 19 years of SNP government, there is one thing that Scotland's middle earners can be certain of, that they will be squeezed ever more to fill the gaps left by the SNP's runaway spending and misplaced priorities. And as the benefits bill blooms, as the civil service grows and as government waste accumulates, it is average earning Scots, nurses, teachers and police officers who are handed the bill repeatedly. And today is no different, because no amount of spin about tax cuts can obscure that fact. The SNP government's tax strategy does nothing, absolutely nothing, to grow the Scottish economy. And in fact, we know that the government's own tax advisory group was sidelined whilst it was being created. And this strategy, I will take an intervention in a moment, this strategy was designed to engineer one cynical headline. But members should consider what it has actually cost to produce that headline. the Government has committed £52 million to deliver a maximum saving of £32 per year for taxpayers. Independent analysts have called it the smallest income tax cut in history. And let's be clear, it is a joke from the SNP, a joke offering from a joke Cabinet Secretary representing a joke government. But that contract conceals a real stealth tax raid on middle earners. By freezing the higher advanced and top rate thresholds until 28-29, the SNP is dragging hundreds of thousands more workers into bans they were never meant to face. Bans that were meant for the few, but are now being paid by the many. And in 2018, a Band 5 teacher was £9,000 below the higher rate tax threshold. Today, that same teacher is £9,000 above it. Teachers and nurses, apparently, Cabinet Secretary, those are the people with the broadest shoulders in John Swinney's Scotland. I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Craig Hoy is, one of the biggest jokers in this Parliament in terms of not being able to do the sums of £1 billion of tax cuts and extra spending commitments which don't add up. But does Craig Hoy not recognise the facts of teachers and nurses in Scotland are earning more after tax than their counterparts elsewhere in the UK? These are facts because of the funding put in place by this government to support pay deals for our public sector workers. Does he accept that, or is he just in fact denial alternative facts?
It is interesting that the Minister admits to say that the benefits of the Barnett formula could give her more money to give teachers higher salaries, that the SNP the government then claws back in higher tax. The simple facts, the Minister wants to talk about facts, 9,000 below the average rate threshold in 2018 and now 9,000 above it because this government's stealth taxes. And Scottish taxpayers are now paying an estimated £1.8 billion more than they would elsewhere in the UK. And combined with Labour's national insurance increases, the SNP and Labour tax rises are set to cost the average full-time Scottish worker nearly £1,800 a year. And the IFS calculates that by 28-29, someone earning £50,000 in Scotland will pay £1,500 more than their equivalent in England. That is not a small amount of money, Minister. And by the end of this decade, 1 in 3 Scottish workers will be paying higher rates of tax. And the economic consequences are now quite clearly undeniable, which is why this budget isn't just undesirable, it is also unaffordable, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies has repeatedly warned in increasingly alarmist language. Because Scotland's growth has lagged behind the rest of the UK by a cumulative £11 billion over the last decade. The Scottish Fiscal Commission confirms that income tax revenues are up to £1 billion lower than they would have been had Scotland matched UK growth rates. CBI Scotland calls this tax divergence, and I quote, a handbrake on growth. Sir Tom Hunter says, and I quote, he has never heard so much disquiet amongst business leaders paying yet more and more in tax with poorer and poorer outcomes. But why are taxes in Scotland so high? Because under the SNP, the state has grown out of control. Civil service numbers are up 74% since 2007, and the Cabinet Secretary pledged last June to cut the public sector workforce by 0.5%. But by September, we discovered it had grown by 0.4%. And the government has wasted £6.7 billion of taxpayers' money this Parliament, over £1,200 for every person in Scotland. That is the cost of the SNP. That is the cost of John Swinney. And social security spending is heading for £10 billion by the end of the decade. Taxes are high because the SNP spending is reckless. But the Scottish Conservatives offer a real and minister-costed alternative. We would cut income tax to 90% for all taxable income up to the higher rate threshold, a saving of £444 a year for every taxpayer earning above £15,000. We would uprate the higher rate threshold in line with inflation. I will take an intervention if I get the time back.
Minister.
Cost. If he listens back to any questions on Friday night that I was on with his colleague Megan Gallagher, she was quite clear that they hadn't seen the numbers and they were just making this stuff up as they went along.
Craig Hoy.
The programme may be called Any Questions. I will give him an answer. It is fully costed, and we will match our £1 billion. We will match our £1 billion in tax cuts by cutting the SNP's ballooning benefits bill and taking an axe to the waste that the Minister is incapable of removing from the civil service. And we could fund these tax cuts. Right, I will give way to Ross Greer.
Ross Greer.
Grateful. He says that the Tories would close the spending gap by cutting the benefits bill. The last estimates I saw in studies in the British Medical Journal and the Lancet showed between 100 and 300,000 excess deaths across the UK as a result of UK Tory government austerity. What does he think the impact would be of his proposed cuts to Scotland's social security system?
Cricoy.
Absolutely not.
The IFS have said that this government is living in a parallel universe, and I think Ross Greer is quoting data from a parallel planet. And we also know that, for example, in relation to the benefit system, in relation to the Scottish Child Payment, where there was consensus around its introduction, that 1 in 10 recipients of that payment are now changing the way they're interacting with the labour market. So it's a far more complex issue than Mr Greer is giving it credit for. But we will make sure that we do what Mr McKee seems incapable of doing by cutting the civil service back to 2016 levels. We will reduce quangos by a quarter, and we will fix Scotland's broken benefits system. But anyone watching the actions of this government could be forgiven for thinking that this Parliament only has tax-raising powers. It doesn't. It has tax-varying powers. But under the SNP, the levers are only ever pulled one way, towards higher ever tax. It has never tried to cut tax in any meaningful way, Minister. £32 a year is not a meaningful tax cut. It has never tried to apply the logic of the Laffer curve. Scots are sick and tired of paying more for the SNP's failed projects and misplaced priorities. But there is a different way, a common-sense Conservative way. Lower tax, increase growth, tackle the benefits bill, and in turn generate the tax receipts needed to build a fairer and a better Scotland. A Scotland where hard work is rewarded, a Scotland where excellence returns to our public services, a Scotland where efficiency is at the heart of government. But we will never get this from this failed SNP government and this failed First Minister. And that is why we will vote against the income tax resolution tonight.
Well done. Thank you. I now call on Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Rule 9.16.7 of the Standing Orders dictates that Parliament must agree to a resolution before Stage 3 proceedings of the Budget Bill can begin, and as such, Scottish Labour will support the rate resolution this afternoon. The late UK budget has made the timetable for this year's Scottish Budget challenging and put pressure on our parliamentary procedures, and we will not stand in the way of the necessary mechanisms which will ensure that our police officers, our nurses and local services continue to be funded at the start of the new financial year in only a few short weeks. But over the next few months, we all do know what will happen. We know that the SNP's deeply underwhelming budget will not last the year. Independent experts from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Fraser of Allender Institute are unanimous in their view that yet another emergency budget from whoever forms a government in May is now a racing certainty. The SNP continues to budget on a wing and a prayer, hoping something comes along to bail them out once again. And those are the hallmarks of 19 years of John Swinney budgets: creative accounting, financial sleight of hand and swinging cuts to local government. The SNP has received an additional £10.3 billion for Scotland's budget from the UK Labour government, and Scots will rightly be asking the SNP, where has the money gone? The truth is that the SNP has decimated Scotland's public finances and taken treasured public services like our NHS to the brink. Our NHS is in crisis, with more people in Dundee waiting over 2 years for treatment than the whole of England. Ferries that don't sail, roads that don't get dualled, schools that do not get built, a record of SNP failure and incompetence, a justice system past breaking point with rising crime and overcrowded jails, a rotten culture of secrecy where the SNP circle the wagons to protect their own rather than serving the people they are supposed to represent. And this SNP budget changes none of that, certainly.
Neil Gray.
Michael Mara raises waiting times here in Scotland. Of course, for the last 7 months, waiting times in Scotland have fallen here in our NHS. Does he have any comment to make on the reports that the NHS in England is paying trusts to incentivise them to remove patients from their lists?
Michael Mara.
Well, what I can comment on is the conversations I had just this week with people in Dundee who are having to take money out of both savings and go to put money on credit cards to have hips replaced as a result. And he claims credit for this. He's claiming that waiting lists are going down. We also know that we have direct flights from Glasgow to Lithuania where people are travelling to get these basic procedures undertaken, because the long waits are ruining people's lives in Scotland. Frankly, it is a record of failure, and Mr Gray might want to face up to it. But yes, this SNP budget changes none of that. It does seek to fix a few of the mistakes that they have made over the last 20 years, but it will not fix the mess that the SNP has made of our finances and our public services. It will not clear out the rot of a complacent government which has lost touch with the people it is meant to serve. This SNP record is one of failure, incompetence and missed opportunities for the people of Scotland. The SNP will never take the bold, decisive action needed to fix what they've broken in our country, and the real opportunity for change will be on May the 7th.
Thank you. I now call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland has been on a journey. We've come quite far on that journey over the last decade when it comes to income tax and progressive taxation more widely. 2016 was the first election to this Parliament where tax was a major topic of debate. Some wanted to see tax cuts, others wanted to see small increases, but by and large most of those proposals were all or nothing. Either everyone's income tax went up, everyone's income tax went down, or it stayed the same. The Greens made the case for a different system. We wanted to see a system where those on higher incomes did contribute more, but where those with lower incomes paid less. The current system is a result of that argument. It's a result of those early years of discussions between ourselves and SNP colleagues where we agreed to something quite different to the system we'd inherited from the UK government. We now have the most progressive income tax system in the UK. As Craig Hoy said himself, the result of that is £1.8 billion more to spend per year on public services like our NHS than would otherwise be the case. Without that money, we would not have been able to deliver policies like the Scottish Child Payment or free bus travel for young people. Without that money, we would not have been able to make Scotland the only part of the UK where child poverty is falling. I'll take Mr Hoy's intervention.
Craig Hoy.
I thank Mr Greer for quoting my words back at me, but does he also accept that because of the woeful underperformance of the Scottish economy under the SNP, that £1.8 billion drops to less than £1 billion?
Ross Greer.
I accept that the fiscal framework results in Scotland having to constantly compare its tax performance, its income performance to London and the South East. If the fiscal framework recognised that London and the South East are so utterly different to everywhere else in the UK's economy, Scotland would be in a very different position. There is a significant need for reform of the fiscal framework nonetheless. This year, the Scottish Greens did not propose, as part of our budget negotiations, further changes to income tax, though. We believe that Scotland already has a progressive income tax system. We proposed changes elsewhere. I'm glad that we were able to come to agreements with the Government on the introduction of a private jet tax, properly taxing those 12,000 incredibly polluting flights into Scotland every year, a new mansion tax, new bands for the council tax, and removing shooting estates from the small business bonus scheme. They were masquerading as small businesses to receive tax benefits that they simply didn't need. Now, there's always going to be a little bit more that we could do on income tax. We will always need to make sure that we maintain progressivity in the system. But the focus now, and I think the focus in the next session of this Parliament, needs to be on shifting the burden of tax from work to wealth. The single biggest failure of this Parliament in its 27 years has been the failure to reform the council tax. We've come so far on income tax. We've been able to do an incredible amount for our constituents with the money that we've raised. And yet our other major tax in Scotland, the other tax that almost everybody, the vast majority of people, our households pay, has been left untouched from the system we inherited in 1991, that quick and dirty compromise to replace the hated poll tax. So there is much, much more that we need to do in the next session of this Parliament, and that needs to be underpinned by a far greater degree of honesty in these debates around tax and spend. It is not credible for parties to come to this Parliament demanding that the government spends more, hundreds of millions of pounds more, whilst also demanding that it cuts income tax or that it cuts other forms of devolved taxation. The final point I want to make, Presiding Officer, is the need for us to actually spend less time in this Parliament debating tax powers, because we've given far more control over tax to local government. Local government knows what the economic, social and environmental needs of its communities are, far greater than a national Parliament will. We cannot devolve income tax, clearly, but there is a desperate need to reform local taxation in this country, to give our colleagues in local government the powers that they need. We heard it in the debate previous to this one, issues like the cruise ship levy that would massively benefit communities like Inverclyde that I represent, or places like Orkney. I hope that in the next session of this Parliament we can defend our progressive record on income tax, but move to the much more urgently needed work that is required now to fairly tax wealth in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Greer. Before I call Willie Rennie, I am aware of several conversations going on in the Chamber. Let's be courteous to one another. Willie Rennie.
I had a rather disturbing dream last night and it involved Craig Hoy. And the dream was that Craig listed every single Liberal Democrat achievement in the budget process. And he started off with the Community Fund, then he went on to colleges, hospices, young entrepreneurs, the money for the islands, he went on about business rates, he went on about the colleges, have I said colleges already? He covered all of those things. And then I woke up. And now I've been subjected to a lecture from Craig Hoy, who supported Liz Truss's budget only a few years ago. But there is an important lesson, because I remember when John Swinney was standing in for Finance Secretary and he told us that the tax increase that was to be introduced in that year was to be an emergency. And I remember asking him at that time, if it's an emergency, when we're through the emergency, does the tax go back down again? And the answer was a bit vague, non-committal. And what's resulted since is the tax rise has been embedded and it's not an emergency tax anymore. Now, I've supported tax rises in the past. We've proposed it back in the 2016 election that we should use for the first time the powers of the Parliament that we had at that time. But we opposed the subsequent tax rises proposed by this government because we think we have to be incredibly careful with trust on tax. Because we saw during the Humza Yousaf period, but also the tail end, not just now, the tail end of the Nicola Sturgeon government, that I think the government lost control. And it lost control, and taxes, it looked like, were going up at every single opportunity. Every time the government spoke, new taxes were on the horizon. And Humza Yousaf was talking about even more tax rises that were over the horizon if he had his way. And that's where I have a difference of opinion with the government, because I think we need to be incredibly careful. Because it's not just about, I mean, of course there is behavioural change that comes from actual tax policy, but it's the trust that people have in governments and what's going to happen next. It's the rhetoric that matters even more. If people think that the government has lost control on taxation, when they have got life choices to make about where to live and where to work, and whether to work, or whether to retire, or whether to go part-time, in other words, behavioural changes, they will take those choices that won't benefit our economy. And that's where I'm not arguing, as the Tories would be, for a reckless tax cut, because we've got to be very, very controlled with all of this. We've got to be predictable. We've got to give confidence to people. But what I do urge the government to do is to be incredibly careful when we make any change whatsoever, because we don't want to go back to those days where people just lost trust completely in what the government were doing. But I think there is also a lesson from the Auditor General, because although the government is now blaming the fiscal framework, which was negotiated by John Swinney and was hailed by John Swinney, the result of the tax increase is supposed to be getting on to £1.8 billion. The result is only £600 million net. And because of the fiscal framework, because of our lower earnings and lower employment growth in Scotland. So the impact of the tax rise isn't as substantial as the government would have hoped. So equally, we've got to be careful when we do propose any tax changes. But as Michael Mara said, this tax resolution has got to pass in order for us to move on to stage 3. We will be supporting it today, but I would just urge the government to be incredibly cautious and to look at those tax differentials between Scotland and the rest of the UK, consider the behavioural change that has already happened as a result of those changes, and be incredibly careful. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call on the Minister to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to begin by thanking members for their contributions to this debate, and I'll come on to talk to some of those shortly. Parliament's been asked today to vote on a key policy that underpins the budget and raises the revenue needed to fund public services and provide financial support to families across Scotland. Last year we made commitments to provide stability and certainty in income tax for taxpayers and the business community to support a growing economy in Scotland, and it's a commitment that this budget proposal delivers on. In all our income tax decisions, we carefully balance the need to raise revenue with the impact on individuals, households and the wider economy. The Scottish Fiscal Commission estimate income tax will bring in £21.5 billion for the Scottish budget in 26-27. And Scottish Government analysis indicates that these changes will mean over 55% of Scots, everyone earning less than around £33,500, is set to pay less income tax in 26-27 than they would elsewhere in the UK. We continue to use every lever at our disposal to grow the economy, create an opportunity for people across Scotland and increase our tax revenues. And it's for other parties to propose uncosted tax cuts to explain how these will be afforded without running down the vital public services that many of the lowest paid in our society rely on. We've always been clear on the need for cross-party engagement on tax and spending, and the productive discussions and agreements we gained from colleagues ahead of the budget reflects that credible alternatives are always welcome by this government. And this proposed budget provides help and support for families with the cost of living and provides a tax cut for some of the lowest paid individuals who will continue to invest in meaningful public services used by families all across Scotland. And turning to some of the contributions that have been made, we again heard Craig Hoy and his party's position that they want to see another billion or £1.5 billion, I can't remember, on top of the £1.5 billion that we're already delivering in efficiency. On top of that, they've got no idea where that's going to come from, and they're just throwing numbers out there in the hope of. Well, I look forward to seeing your detailed proposals on where those savings. It has already been published. Already been published, our proposals, and very clear on that. And whatever they propose is in addition to this. Of course, the reality is that would mean significant cuts to public services across the country. But Craig Hoy also made the comments I always make about Scotland's economy. So I just want to put him right on some of the facts. Scotland's economy is that last year and the year before, indeed, when his party was in power in Westminster for part of that period, is growing faster than the economy across the rest of the UK. We've got consistently lower unemployment in Scotland, and that gap is widening in the latest figures, 3.8% versus 5.2% in the rest of the UK. We've now got consistently the best performing foreign direct investment for 10 years in Scotland, better than anywhere else in the rest of the UK outside of London. And as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, and I think answers the point that Willie Rennie makes, of course we watch very closely the impact of these changes, but what we are seeing after these tax changes is net inward migration of taxpayers to Scotland. That's been continuing for quite a number of years now. So that trend is clear. People recognise that if you earn more, you pay more tax in Scotland, but the range of benefits you get for that more than outweighs that tax differential and the economic opportunities with Scotland's growing economy compared to the rest of the UK is something that they want to be part of, and they are very welcome to come and do so. And of course, in the last budget, he talked about whenever cut taxes. Of course, Scotland is the only place with a 19% tax rate, and we increased the thresholds by significantly more than inflation for those lower bands, in contrast to the UK government that froze their bands right across the piece. So we are serious about raising more revenue. We do understand the impact that has. We are focused on continuing to grow Scotland's economy at a faster rate than the rest of the UK. And members should be clear about what not voting for this rates resolution means in practice. It would restrict the revenues collected from income tax from helping businesses and the people we all serve across the country by stalling Parliament from moving forward with the budget. And it's for this reason we hope all members will vote positively for this motion, considering the importance of the revenue collected, so that Scotland remains a great place to live, work, study and do business in. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on the Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2026 to 2027. And the question is that motion 20844, in the name of Shona Robertson, on the Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2026 to 2027 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.